Morna, how are you? Welcome on Just Get a Real Job. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, and I'm well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I was just saying to you off air, this is the second one we've done back in 2025, so I'm still warming up, still getting used to doing these again. But it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. And you're a screenwriter, you're a playwright, you've been writing for a number of years. We've, of course, worked together on River City. You wrote a brilliant Christmas episode for us this year, which I've had the pleasure of script editing, but you've done lots of work. So do you want to just quickly introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about you, and we'll get into your career and some of your writing wisdoms and stuff.
Yeah, I've always hoped that one day I would have like a magical introduction to myself, that I would be able to say something kind of coherent. And I always feel when people say, "What do you do?" I kind of go, "Oh yeah, I write words," and I stumble a wee bit. But yeah, pretty much what you just said. I have been predominantly a playwright for the last 10 years, and then for the last 4 years or so, I've started to move into screen. Before that, I don't really talk about this, but I was working a wee bit as an actor and a musician. Those days are kind of pretty much behind me now. So yeah, mostly plays and screen, and I feel very, very fortunate that I've made a career out of this slightly wild roller coaster of an industry. It feels pretty magical to be able to do this, and I honestly do not take that for granted ever. Yeah.
And what's interesting, I suppose, as well about your career and work is it's very like you've done a lot of work in Scots and like really rooted it in where you're from and stuff. Obviously, growing up in the northeast of Scotland, it must have had a big impact on that. But like I don't know, a lot of your work it uses music, it uses very specific themes and things. So like, tell us a bit about that. Like, how is where you're from influenced that?
Yeah. I suppose it's tricky to kind of pick out a kind of first starting point. When I was in drama school, I was down in London, and I remember feeling like I just didn't really fit in very much. Like the way I spoke, I was the only Scot, but also I was speaking Scots sometimes, like in the way that I wasn't even necessarily recognizing when I was falling into Scots. And yeah, I just felt like I was a wee bit I was the working class person. I spoke a wee bit different, all those kind of things. I was working like 3 jobs when I was there, everything kind of bit of an outsider. And I remember one of the tutors saying to me, "Everything that you think makes you different is what will make you work in this industry." And at the time, that sounded nice, but I didn't really know what it meant. And then actually the more that I have gone, that when I moved into writing, I guess I very quickly realized the truth behind that actually the stories that I wanted to tell were rooted in the Northeast, and they were rooted in the voice that I grew up with and the voices that I grew up with. So a lot of my kind of first plays were from the Northeast and for the Northeast as well. And I started playwriting really because pretty tragically, my dad was lost at sea when I was a kid. I was 5 years old. And I always had this idea that I would write something that I could dedicate to him somehow, some kind of tribute to him, and also to, where I'm from, that's not uncommon. Like lots of men and boats are lost, and I wanted to write something that I could pay tribute to those lost men. And like, it was a very specific story that I wanted to tell, and it made 100% sense that was always going to be in the Northeast. I didn't set out particularly to write it in Scots. It just was, because those were the voices that exist in that area. It was kind of the defining moment, I guess, for me, because I didn't necessarily write that play to become a playwright. It was when we did the first rehearsed reading and people kind of put that label on me. Oh, you're a playwright now, so what are you going to write next? I kind of had that really belated moment of going, oh, people think I'm a playwright now. I better learn how to write plays. I'm slightly covering two subjects there. One is like the first time I wrote a play and writing in the Northeast, but I guess they kind of go hand in hand, because I think they do kind of take me back down to going, I was writing about something that I knew, something that was my world. And yeah, it kind of, I guess, is what made me a playwright.
I think it's a really interesting answer, because there's loads of things I want to sort of unpack from that. But
yeah,
I think one is interesting that you became a playwright almost by accident, because you had a story to tell, but you maybe didn't think about how it would work. And secondly, like, I didn't know about that about your dad and stuff. And I think that's kind of almost mad in the sense that I know you were saying it's very common where you grew up, but like to a lot of people, that sounds like a film or something that just wouldn't happen in real life. Like, it feels like a very specific thing. So, I mean, one of my questions I always ask my guests is, how did your sort of childhood and early life sort of affect you as a creative person? But that must have had a huge impact on your life and probably influenced you sort of becoming, you know, an actor and then a writer and stuff, obviously, because you were saying you had that story to tell the whole time. So are you happy to sort of tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that is quite an extraordinary thing to happen at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, it's one of those stories that is really tragic. And I think when I was younger, I don't think I even necessarily knew what it meant. You know, my dad was a fisherman. He would leave, he would go to sea, so he'd be away, and then he didn't come back. And it's funny, I think when you're a kid, you can understand sometimes that something is a bit different about you, but I think it was years kind of growing up with this loss and this kind of absence and this not kind of understanding. Like, it was years, I think, for those things to really sink in and hit me, kind of. But I think, yeah, from a young age, I was probably asking pretty big questions. And I think even that term, you know, lost at sea, is one that, like, people don't even necessarily understand that term, you know, and that someone doesn't come back again. And in the case of my dad, his body was never found. So, you know, it's it's a tragedy in every way. And I think it's why, I guess, when it came to that first play that I wrote, it had been burning inside me for years. You know, this kind of growing up with that story inside, growing up feeling the loss, feeling the absence, feeling different somehow, not really knowing how to process emotion particularly. You know, and yeah, I think that all of that was bubbling away inside. And I feel really lucky that, you know, when I was in school, like, there were lots of like little creative things that happened along the way. You know, my primary school had a choir, and back then somebody would come around the school and give you instruments. So I was given a fiddle, and like, so there was always a kind of creative side of me, and I was writing stories and things. So I think, like, kind of hand in hand, those two things were kind of moving along together. Yeah, I think it shaped everything about me. I think it shaped the kind of, I don't think I would be a writer had I not experienced that in my childhood, because I think I've always written to kind of make sense of the world. I feel like I've always written to kind of go to ask questions, and I've never necessarily found an answer, but I think I've found some kind of comfort in the writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I look back at that first play that I wrote, and I kind of did everything that everyone said not to do. Like I wrote it for 10 actors. And at the time, folk were like, never write your first play for more than 3. It will never go on stage.
Yeah, lots of two-handers, one room. Yeah, all the
Yeah.
classic advice.
And I wrote this, 2.5-hour epic, 10-strong cast. Very much like right from the bones of it, there was all those things you said earlier, kind of movement and music. And because you have this question, I guess, of going, how do you build this world of the sea on stage? So I had this kind of choral voice, and I look back on the person who started work on that, and I go, I think there's such a bravery to what I was doing at the time, and I think it was just that the story had been there for a long time, and because I wasn't really writing it with a viewpoint of I want this play to be made, I was writing it because I felt like I needed to write it. Then I pushed forward, and honestly, hats off, because I don't know if I'd be that brave now to do it.
I was going to ask you that because I think when you're a certain age, especially in the creative industries, like sometimes almost having a naivety about it. And I think this is what I try and say to people listening that want to be, maybe tonight listening to this episode, they want to be a writer, right? It's so hard to give advice on certain things because there is no right path and everyone's path is different. But I think sometimes it's actually when you just do something bravely and because it's a story you want to tell and there's not actually any rules to it. I know that's really unhelpful. There'll probably be people listening going, but that's so unhelpful. Like, I don't know how to make that. But I think that's the mad thing about it. Like sometimes it is that way, isn't it? Where you just like, you were asking me before we started recording, like what made me start this podcast. And I think if I'd maybe thought about it the way I think about it now, I probably wouldn't have started the podcast because you just do something because you're like, I want to do you know what I mean? And it's when you attach what you learn about it, once you started doing it, it's much more, it becomes more of a thing and you maybe apply rules and expectations to it. Whereas it sounds like when you were writing that play, you didn't have any expectations. There wasn't really a plan or an idea as such. You just wanted to tell it and you just sort of did it your own way, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and like I am so proud of that play. I'm so proud that it was staged in 2019. It won awards, which is amazing. Like I mean that it took kind of 7 years from me starting work on it for it to go on stage. But I'm so proud of it. I can also look at it and go, like, I didn't know what I was doing necessarily as a playwright. Like I didn't have the language of being able to say things like, this is an inciting incident, this is a midpoint, this, the kind of more technical language. And in some ways, when I look at it now, I can look at it with the eye of going, oh, this doesn't necessarily follow all of the technical rules. But what works with it is that, like, I wrote it with all the heart in the world. And that is what I think made it the play that it is. Because over those years that it took from kind of first writing it to go into production, I probably could have gone back and changed more structurally and kind of, I don't know, thought more about it from a technical lens. But that's not what it was, and it's not necessarily what it needed to be, and it's not necessarily the story that I was telling. It's really interesting. Like I don't know if you have this, like, listening back to older podcast episodes, and I don't know if you listen back and go, oh, I should have asked that question differently, or I could have done this.
I do that now, Morna. I'll do that with this episode. I'll edit this and go, oh, I should have said, you know what I mean? But that's just like, we're always critical. Like, but yeah, I do. I listen back sometimes if I'm having a guest back on or something, and I'm like, wow, that's mad. Like, but again, that's the joy of it. It's like, it's like musicians. They always love the most recent thing they made. Even if the fans are like, nah, your second album was way better than the fifth one, but they love the one they're doing now because you have to, I think.
Yeah. I guess there's something for me with writing. This is about theatre in particular. That after you've written something, after a bit of time has passed, maybe after there's a production, like it, or maybe even once you go into a rehearsal room and you start to really share that play with actors and a director and a designer, and it's not just yours anymore. It becomes this kind of collaborative piece, and it feels like it's taken a team at that point to kind of build it up and outwards. And then you bring in an audience as well. Like, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's wholly yours. And I guess there's something about, like, when I look back at old scripts, some of them I look back on and I'll be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I wrote that, or that line is terrible, what was I thinking? Or I'll see something very obvious in it and go, I needed to do this. But there are other things that I read that I've written in the past that, like, I read them and I'll be like, oh, that's really good. I can't believe I wrote that. I'm never going to be able to write anything that good again. You know, like, it's this weird spectrum of, like, part of me can't believe I wrote it, and then the other side of me is like, I can't believe I wrote that. You know, it kind of depends on the piece and how much time has passed. Like, neither feel like they're mine necessarily, but they're both, these two sides.
And it probably changes. There could be a day where you look back and someone go, that's brilliant, and a day where you're like, ooh. So again, it can depend on your mood. Really interesting sort of answers there, Morna. But I want to kind of go back when you were writing this Lost at Sea, right? Like, I know you were saying it took 7 years to get on the stage, but what were you sort of doing at that point? What was in your, because you were saying, I didn't really think of myself as a playwright. Was there a moment where you thought, this is going all right, I'm sort of writing this, I can maybe become a playwright as a career? Or were you did you just not really have to think about it like that at the time, because that maybe would have felt so unrealistic or a bit crazy?
I'm not sure. So I had been working so before the kind of like journey to get to the play was, so when I was in school, I was really interested in theatre, and I guess in that way that you do when you're I was part of like a Sunday youth theatre group up in Elgin, and we had drama at my school, so that kind of thing. Like, I was really interested in it, but I didn't really think that much more about jobs in theatre, and I didn't really think or like understand that it's get a real job, you know, it's that kind of side. So for me, when I was leaving school, I trained as a journalist, because it was like, okay, the words, I like words, that feels like a kind of step.
So you're always kind of writing then. There was always that thing in you.
Like, I mean, I was a pretty geeky kid as well. Like, I was the one who was writing stories about like the alternative Cinderella, the stories of the two sisters kind of thing, you know. Like, I loved writing stories. I never shared them with anyone, but like I loved them. I mean, they would be horrendous, but I probably thought they were really cool at the time in my secret notebooks. I've totally lost what I was saying. What was your question before I got distracted? My two.
We were kind of just talking about like where you were at the sort of the pathway into becoming like a playwright, like from, you know, starting that journey and then going, oh my, okay, this is a living now. I'm actually doing this regularly and being paid to do it.
Yeah. So like I'd been a journalist, then I went to, and I kind of, when I was studying journalism, I kind of set myself this mark of saying, okay, if I'm still interested in theatre by the time I finish journalism training, then I'll audition for drama schools just to see. And I got in. So like I was kind of holding these two things, like performance and journalism. So when it came to also writing that first play, I was like, okay, if you put them together, it is that playwriting. But yeah, after I wrote Lost at Sea and we did this first rehearsed reading of it, was the moment really of people saying, you know, like, what are you going to write next? Around about that time, I had applied for Playwright Studio Scotland, who are a brilliant organisation, and they still do these programmes now. But they had a mentoring programme, so I'd applied for that and been matched with Peter Arnott, who mentored me over a year. And it was really interesting, I guess, because when you're working with a mentor and you can see what they've done, you can start to go, oh, I wonder how is there any version of this that I can go from what I'm doing now to where you are? But I had this, the biggest voice for me was this panic voice of, I guess it's that imposter syndrome thing, isn't it? Like with that term playwright being out in the world now, and I just felt like I felt a bit of a frog. So I was like, well, I've written one play. And then, so I panicked myself basically into, like, I would go to the playwright studio and they have like a plays library, so you can take out multiple plays. And I was just there all the time, like borrowing plays, thinking, right, okay, if I can just teach myself how to do this, then maybe I can call myself a playwright. And it's funny, like, how long that ticked on for me, kind of masking myself with this not really a play. Like, when do I get to call myself a playwright? When do I get to validate that that's what I do? And it probably took me ages, you know, like that was not, it wasn't the easiest thing for me to do, because I think I thought the minute that I called myself that, I don't know, that someone would laugh at me, or like, who do you think you are? You're not actually a playwright. And I don't know how much of that is the working class side.
I think it is a Scottish working class, or maybe not even Scottish, because I think this is clearly a thing in the UK, but we'd had this a lot on the show. And one of my previous guests who was Irish called this notions, like this idea of like, don't get notions above your station. Like that's in my head. I feel like sometimes, I mean, I've worked full-time in TV for 3.5 years, so I have a right to say, like, that's my career, I've made it work. But sometimes you go in somewhere in public and you feel like such a wank even saying that, because in your head you're like, oh, you know what I mean? It's hard, and it's hard to rewrite that. Like, it's hard to be in a space that's very traditionally middle class and feels quite exclusive, and go, I have a right to be here. I'm part of this. I can call myself this. And it must be even harder for you as a writer, which is even harder to do than what I do.
I mean, the fact when you were just saying about the middle class industry, that's not changing. I think that's it, you know. And when you look out, every year there are statistics published, and I mean, you don't even have to go and read the statistics. You can look at some of the, you Google the names of, or at least I Google the names of, like, people that I've seen directing something or writing something, and it's that, you know, you go to a wiki page and there's something about aunties. I was like a lady, and there's kind of, I don't know, like it can be really hard to go, oh, right, do I belong? Do I belong in this world? And I like, probably it's taken me, I think, longer than most to kind of have an ownership of what I do, because I mean, I've been really fortunate with my playwriting career in particular, and I've worked with, you know, the Lyceum and the Traverse and, like, brilliant Scottish theatres, and, like, I was under commission to some of those theatres, walking in for a meeting and feeling that anxiety brewing, that exact feeling of, I don't belong here. And you're like, what permission am I waiting for? Because I've got the piece of paper that says I am working with this organization. You know, my play has been produced. What am I waiting for? Because that sense of, I don't belong here, this isn't my world, you're part of it. There's just such an interest in psychology behind it, and I would, you know, I feel like I think about this a lot and have no answers. I feel like that's most of my life, is thinking a lot and not having answers.
But no, it's such a weird space to work in, and I feel like I wrestle with this all the time. And I mean, something I try to do with this podcast is make it a great resource to make this industry as accessible as possible, to help people, you know, show people that anyone belongs in this industry. There's a place for us all. And I think it's really important to hear someone like you, who a listener might look at and go, Morna Young's a very successful writer. she's had a really good career so far, and you're still saying, like, even when I was under commission from a big theatre and I've had my name on the BBC, etc., on shows like River City, I still feel anxiety, I still feel imposter syndrome. I think that's really important for you to talk about, because there's clearly a bigger thing at play here, and I think it's very, very common. I know exec producers who, feel a bit of imposter syndrome, and the amount of big guests we have on this show that are like, yeah, I still feel that. So there's clearly still, there's something going on there. And I think it's a product, particularly in television and theatre and stuff, of being such a middle class and quite an exclusive industry. I don't even know if that articulates it well enough, saying just middle class, but I don't know. There's a glamour to it, and I don't know how we get over that. And there's clearly a lot of work to do on accessibility and stuff.
Yeah, I also think that there can be a kind of, and I don't even know if this is necessarily middle class, maybe I'm going into like upper class. There can be this kind of, there can be a confidence around this. And I think, I think there can be that, it's that difference between, I think, growing up being told that you can be whoever you want to be, do whatever you want to do, or what you said earlier, the version of don't get above yourself. How are you going to make money? What are you going to do? Like, one installs fear inside you, and the other one is that unshakable confidence. And the thing is, confidence doesn't always match talent, right? And
it definitely doesn't.
And I think, like, when you look back in history, all of our like famous writers, they weren't on camera doing interviews. They weren't pitching new ideas. Like, there's a kind of, I guess there's something about being a writer now that seems to also mean that you need to have a bit of confidence behind you. And if you are on the shyer side, that, or more insecure, or bringing all these feelings of, I'm not sure if I belong, like, you're still having to go into those meetings and convince somebody to give you a job. Whereas the person who's been in there before you, the person who's going after you, that, might be like, it's this salesman something that make it sound incredible, but might not be able to match up. I have lots of questions always about the kind of pitch world. And I think it is that, like, I always feel instinctively that my best pitches are on paper because I'm a writer, and I can structure it on paper.
Yeah, completely. And I think it should be based on that fundamentally. If you pitch an idea, it should really be on, is the script and the voice good, not how did I give a presentation about this? And I think the problem with maybe the commissioning landscape, which I've worked behind the scenes in before, and like development and stuff, and I think it's a really interesting world and there's lots of good things there. I think what's interesting about it is there is that you need to be very, are you going to click with the people that work there, and are you going to give a good pitch, and are you able to sell it? And it's a really tricky balance there about, should it more just be led by the voice? And again, that's a problem with things like networking for people. Like, personally, I'm quite lucky. I'm quite an extroverted person. I think I do well at networking. I think I do quite well at interviews. But I've got really close friends who maybe are a bit shy and maybe aren't as good at communicating in that space. And I feel it's unfair that they're almost excluded from this industry because of that, because they aren't able to, put themselves out there. And then that doesn't bring into the case things like class, disability, race, all these other, factors. So I think there's a lot of work in this industry to do around accessibility and making sure those amazingly talented voices that probably exist that no one's hearing because they don't have the confidence to share it or put themselves out there, that we're probably missing.
Yeah. And there's also something like, I've heard this before and I agree with this. There's also something kind of, and I don't really want to be kind of binary about this, but there's something more inherently like masculine about pitching, and I don't like, it's something that I have had to like really, really, really force myself to kind of try to get better at in some ways, because I feel like I can write something that I'm really excited about, and someone will say, tell us about your idea, and immediately I'm reduced to this like absolute yammering kind of, it's a story about a woman, and she she kind of like, and I make this thing sound terrible, right?
Mhm.
I have to be the person who, in my head I'm going, take a breath, think about it, what are you going to say? And I mean, I also have the slight side of me as well. Like I'm also better with words on paper. And the whole thing about don't laugh at someone who like mispronounces words when they speak them out loud because they probably read them in a book. Like that's me in every way. And I sometimes reach for a word and I know the word and I can see the word, and I have that moment of kind of panic going, I don't know how I'm going to pronounce this right.
Mhm.
I'm better on paper than I am talking.
Yeah.
It's different skills,
What are sort of some things you've maybe learned then in your sort of career so far as you've maybe got more established as a writer? Like for say someone listening right now, they're like, I'm really relating to what you're saying, Morna. I'm quite shy. Or I'm much better presenting on paper, but I've got this pitch coming up, or I'm trying to get my idea picked up. Have you learned any skills that have maybe helped you get better at it, or is there anything you've sort of learned along the way that's helped you improve? I think I've just said the same thing twice in a different way, but
it was great. It gave me time to go, what have I learned actually? I mean, this probably sounds silly, but like, I mean, I don't know if I'm doing this in this chat as well. Sometimes that thing of repeating a question back.
No, I like it. I've started saying things sometimes in conversations in real life, like, good question. But what I'm really doing is I'm buying myself time.
Buy time. I also think like that idea that I just said about taking a breath, like I also think I have enough nerves about me that if there's a gap, I have to, my temptation is going to be to kind of fill that gap somehow.
Yeah.
And also to just go, take the breath. Don't be afraid of taking a pause. That's okay. I think it's always like, I guess it's always identifying what the fear is. And like, I feel like we're talking about school a lot. Like, where I'm from, when a question was asked in school, no, you didn't put your hand up. Like, there was, you didn't want to put your hand up because you didn't want to
Stand out.
answer or stand out or like, yeah. So like there's no part of me really until I went to university and saw the way that some people could speak about an idea. It was absolutely mind-blowing for me because that's not something that I'd ever done. It's making me think of oh my goodness, the amazing TV show that was on Normal People.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see it?
Of course, yeah, I love that. I'm a big Sally Rooney fan, so I was all there for it.
When he goes to university and they're all sat around the table discussing it, that like it actually hit me in my chest because I was like,
world, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, I know this feeling. I know that feeling of people being able to really kind of eloquently talk through an idea or debate something, and it's not something that I had any knowledge. I didn't.
It's not something they really teach you at comprehensive school in the UK or in Scotland. Like you don't do really. I mean, some schools obviously do run it, but traditionally when I was growing up, you didn't really do debate club. You didn't do public speaking. No one taught me how to do that either. Like all of that stuff has come from me learning it myself, or maybe drama a wee bit, but even then, that's not the same. That's not the same skill. So we aren't really taught that. They teach that at private school or at posh universities and things. Like they teach you how to do that. It's a great skill.
I think Americans as well always seem very like much more confident in. I guess it's that idea, isn't it, that you have like that your opinion might be valid, and And quite often, I think if you know, like in the school that I went to, it sounds like in the school that you went to, like you're not, no one's kind of saying to you, your opinion's really valid. You know, express your opinion. How do you feel? That's one that's taken me years to kind of be able to think
Yeah.
about. How do you feel?
And I suppose now everyone does that online, don't they? Everyone does that on Twitter or on Instagram, and that's not actually saying it. That's just putting it on in a different form. So that's, I suppose, the new version of that now. So people are still not learning how to communicate that in a conversation or in a presentation space. I want to quickly touch on the thing you said about America, which I think is really interesting. The first thing is, I remember, we don't have to talk about the American election in too much detail, but I remember watching the American election coverage and thinking, these politicians are so good at talking in front of a stage, like Republican or Democrat. They're very good emoters, they're good communicators. And if you compare it to like a lot of the politicians we have in the UK, bar a few, like they're crap emoters. They're not very good storytellers on stage. They're really stiff and wooden. And I wonder if that feeds into this idea we're talking about, the difference in cultures and what we learn in school, particularly with maybe a Labour government where most of the people in the cabinet didn't go to private school. I think that maybe highlights it more. But yeah, and the second thing is, and I know there's lots of flaws with the American dream, but I do think when I've interviewed American creatives before, they're sort of told no matter their class and background, you can achieve whatever. Go and follow your dreams. That's not necessarily the best thing to tell a kid as well. I know it's about balance, but as we talked about much of this interview, like, you know, we're the opposite. We're like, oh, are you sure you want to be a script editor? Are you sure you want to be a writer? Are you going to go work?
Are you sure?
Do you not fancy getting a real job and having a mortgage or not? Do you know what I mean? So it's the total opposite mindset, and we're already at a disadvantage because we're battling against our own self-criticism often, and that sort of, yeah, it's really interesting. I'm getting very animated talking about this, but it's all very useful stuff, I think, for people to hear.
Yeah, but it's also like when you're talking about like Labour politicians being a little bit stiffer and like not going to private schools as much, like there's also something, I think, this is a wee bit of a side point, but like as a society, we seem to really fall for the thing of it's not what someone's saying, it's how they say it. Which takes us back into when we were talking about pitching as well. Like, is it the best idea in the world, or is the person just great at pitching? Because those are they're different.
Very different things, yeah.
And actually, someone could be the worst speaker ever, and not like my thoughts are constantly like boom, 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 boom. You know, I'm not linear in the way I talk. I think about 20 different things at once. But it doesn't necessarily mean that person could be saying something brilliant. They might just not be saying it in the most coherent way. We're gonna listen to the showman of it though, which is why I think we end up with people like, I don't even want to say his name, back in power, you know?
And then it's also why you end up, and I mean, I'm not going to name any shows or anything like that because obviously it's always bad press, but you wonder, like, do people commission things? But do you because you go, how is that being commissioned? And you think back, like, they must have just pitched that so well, like exactly what you're saying, and they went, we'll commission that. But the story behind it was terrible. It just had a really good like, you know, frontline. No, it's really interesting. We went on a massive tangent. I think it's been really interesting. But just to quickly go back to my original question and recap for people listening, can you very quickly distill like the things you learned that have made you slightly better pitching, just very succinctly if possible?
I mean, I feel like I gave you a slightly wanky answer there because I was talking about taking a deep breath and repeating the question. During the pandemic, I did the Masters in Screenwriting at GCU, and that was one of the things that they made us practice again and again and again. And it was during the pandemic, so it was on Zoom. And actually being in that kind of, I guess, that educational environment was really good for me because it gave me that kind of safer space to practice something in. And being on Zoom, I could also have the document in front of me, which was that kind of safety blanket, having it right there. By the time I was leaving that course, I felt I had a bit more confidence in pitching, but then it was back to the real world.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other different ball game. And I think it's difficult for me to I guess even give advice or a lesson on this, because I feel like I'm still learning how to do it. And in some ways, I think in theatre in particular, I'm probably forgiven a bit more for giving a pitch that's a wee bit rubbish, because actually I think I have a catalogue of work behind me
Do you
now.
think the work almost speaks for itself in the theatre because you're very comfortable in that space now? And you've maybe, a lot of people in Scotland particularly will look, but it's Morna Young, she's done, you know, these plays, they'd all been very successful, so we like you anyway, sort of thing. Do you think that maybe helps?
I think that probably does help. And also because in theatre especially, like, I know people much better now. So I've taken away that kind of the barrier that was there for me about having to go in and meet somebody new to talk about something. I also feel much more comfortable, I guess, in theatre to say, to meet somebody for a coffee and say, I've got an idea that I think you might like. Could I send you a one-pager? Mm-hmm. So rather than kind of really getting into it on the spot. On the screen side, I think I'm just like, I am still making mistakes, and I'm still learning, and I'm still trying to figure out always the magic day that I'm going to go into one of those meetings and like just be mega confident. Well, so I do the things like
saying that though, we had those meetings back in the day when I was at STV. We had a couple of generals together, and I didn't think you did. You know, I mean, not that I was in a massively influential position to commission anything or make anything, but I never picked up on you seeming anxious, or you always seem very confident, very like passionate about your work and stuff. So again, it's interesting how we perceive ourselves. But that is really interesting to know, because I do that all the time. People will say to me like, "Oh, I really liked you know, that episode you did," and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, "Oh, I thought that was one of the weaker." Do you know what I mean? It's interesting how we view like different things differently to how other people perceive them. That leads me on really nice. I want to ask you about Screen, because I know this is newer to you, and we talked a lot about your sort of theatre background and things, but you've obviously written quite a few episodes of River City now, which is like obviously a continuing drama. You've got other shows and things in development and things like that. But how do you find the difference? Like, what are the main differences for you? Do you approach it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I approach them completely differently, and in some ways, I guess it depends on, you know, what type of theatre work or what type of screen. And actually, like, working on something like River City is really different to working on an original drama. Is different to working on different kinds of, like, each project is slightly different in some ways. I mean, one of the reasons why I did the masters before moving into Screen, I knew lots of playwrights who jumped straight from one to the other, was partly about confidence for me. And again, there's going to be a theme with this, because I said before I could call myself a playwright, I was like, teach myself to be a playwright. It's what I did with screenwriting. I had supposed to have 4 plays on during the pandemic, which obviously all got pulled. And I was like, how do I use this time? I like to learn. I'm gonna do this course. And I got a scholarship and all that. It was great. But yeah, like, that jump at the time felt terrifying to me. And I was having TV meetings before doing the course. I'd started to dip my toe in. I knew I really wanted to write for River City. I loved it. I just, again, didn't quite have the confidence enough to take that jump without doing a little bit of training first. And I think that's a bit of a constant story for me always, is I don't think I'm great at walking into a space and just kind of pretending I know what I'm doing. Like, I kind of need to have a bit of something. So coming out the other side of that course was brilliant, because I got to do a bit of the kind of the trial and error and failing in that safe environment. But I 100% went to study there going, how do I take my playwriting skills and transfer them into screenwriting skills? I mean, and straight away, people were talking about things like final draft, which I was like, I don't know what that is. So like there was a real kind of, I guess, technical learning for me to start. I think that would be the most obvious straight up difference is when I'm writing plays, and when I mentor a lot of emerging playwrights as well. I work on Word, and I always really encourage playwrights to kind of find, this will probably sound daft, but like to find their voice on the page. And by that, I literally mean like even their formatting, like even the way that they write stage directions. I think there's something in playwriting about really like being able to express yourself entirely with, I'm aware how this sounds, the font you use, like the kind of spacing you use. Like there's a real kind of like playfulness that you can find and really kind of on the page say, this is my voice. And then moving into screen straight away, final draft is something entirely different. You know, like there's much more of a logic to working in screen in some ways. Stage directions, you know, in my adaptation of Sunset Song that was on, I was about to say earlier this year, I mean last year. I can't quite tell where we are. You know, the opening stage direction is it's really poetic. It's about earth and earth and earth. When I moved into screen, I'm like, okay, I need to cut a bit of the poetry from my stage direction.
Because it's for the crew and the director, because no one's reading it. We're watching it. So it's visual. And I think the skill of screenwriting, which because you notice this when you read an amazing script, you're able to be poetic in very little words and very visually tell a visual story that also tells the crew and the director and people filming it what's going on. And that's a really tricky thing to do because it's often less is more. And I think often when as a script editor, when I work with greener writers or newer writers, like something you always can tell is like they're being very poetic, very like flowery with their stage directions. And I think, again, that's fine. And people are learning and everyone's different as well. Like I'm a bit of a weird script editor because I sometimes get a bit like, well, do we need to follow these rules all the time? Because I think, as you said earlier, with your first play Lost at Sea, sometimes following the rules isn't always the best way. So I think it depends on the project. Obviously, on a show like River City, that you need to follow the rules because it's such a well-oiled machine that it would fall down if you didn't. But I do also say to younger screenwriters, don't, you know, it's a balance. I think you need to express your voice, especially with spec scripts and stuff. So it's a tricky one. And there's no right answer, I think, as well as that's something I always caveat so much on this show is that there's no right answer. There's no right way of doing things. This industry is so varied and different.
And I think when you said there about like in screen, knowing that your stage directions are for the crew as well, like that, there's something that's really important in that. And I mean, you're kind of given a blueprint, aren't you? I mean, and that is true on stage as well. Though I think just there's, I mean, I feel like I write them very different. I actually love working on like a theatre script and a screenplay at the same time. I really enjoy that kind of swapping back and forth. And I think maybe part of that is if I get stuck on something, then I go to the other one. And then when I get stuck, like I kind of move around. And it, for some reason, it really works for me to have two documents open at once. I approach them really differently. The way I write dialogue works completely differently. And again, so much of that is, it's really simple things as well. Like what can be done with a look on screen. So much of like, I think about the early things that I was writing, particularly on the course that thank goodness no one will read. Like going back through them with a pen. I mean, like take that out. Whereas, you know, on stage, it's all in that dialogue. Your text is carrying everything. Whereas on screen, it's always thinking about the picture.
Yeah, because sometimes less is more as well, isn't it? I think that's something people forget on screen. Like often it's a look as much as it is. Yeah, it's that. I mean, that is also true in playwriting too, I suppose, but they are different. Yeah. I want to ask you as well, like, because often listeners always want to know this when I'm interviewing a writer, if they're writing, do you have a sort of, what's the way of describing it? Do you have like an approach to writing? Do you have a certain routine you do when you write, or is it, I don't know, is there like a magic system you have where you wake up at this time and you put the coffee on, or is it just a bit more random than that?
This is such an awkward question because, like, every year or every quarter or probably every week, I tell myself I'm going to have more of a routine when I'm writing. Like, I desperately want to be one of those writers who gets up, puts on the coffee, opens up, and writes 10 pages or 500 words, or like really kind of follows the discipline of being able to do the same every day. And it's just not really how my writing brain works. And I try to write every day, but I am somebody that, like, I'm a bit of an immersive writer. I cannot write for 3 days and then fall into writing for 18 hours straight. Like, I feel there's the writer I want to be, and she is very disciplined and does the same kind of every day. And then there's the kind of writer that I am, which is the kind of person that suddenly at 10 p.m. at night, I'll be like, I know what that is. And then I'll fall into, quite often it'll be just when I'm about to fall asleep, closing my eyes, just about to sleep, something will come to me. And it'll buzz enough that I'm like, well, I'm just going to have to get back up again. And yeah, I mean, a bit of a sore subject, I think, because I'm constantly always going, I'm going to be the first. Like, that's what real writers would do every day. And it kind of, I constantly try to train myself to do that, but I kind of, it doesn't really always work for me. Whereas I would be at my happiest really if, when I start to find the flow of an idea, if I could just write straight for 2 days, you know, and emerge out the other side kind of covered in coffee and, like, you know, like, that's like being totally like disgusting. And that, you know, I like, once I kind of once I find what the thread is, like, that's the moment for me. Like, I'm like, I just want to keep going with it and keep going with it.
That's really interesting. Do you think it's helpful to know that there isn't a perfect way to do it, though? Because I think there's a lot of the time, I'm not a writer, but I did study screenwriting. I used to, for a period I wanted to be, and I think something I struggled with, and probably one of the reasons I don't really think writing's for me, is I kept trying to find the perfect way to do, like, as we were talking about, like, I need to get up at this time and I'm going to do it, and I never could do it. And I think that used to frustrate the hell out of me. And it's so disciplined. I just don't think I could get, I don't know. I think you're chasing that all the time, and I find it exhausting, because often you're need to write and not think about that deeply, because there isn't like a perfect way of doing it.
That's it. And like, who came up with the idea that was the perfect way of doing it?
Yeah,
and like,
exactly.
Who came up with a 9 to 5 work day and 5 days, like, you know, because it's not going to work for everyone always. And I don't know if you notice this at River City, but I tend to be the writer. If there's a 9 a.m. deadline the next day, I will submit kind of midnight the night before.
Yeah, I do enjoy it, because obviously we run a 9 till 5-ish schedule, or, you know, 9 till 6, 7, whatever the times would be. And like, I love when writers email me, because the times vary so much, which just shows the listeners how different writers are. Like, you know, my jobs, I know so many different writers and have to work with them. And what I love is they're all so different. They take notes differently, they submit differently. So there's no right way. I think that's the biggest Les Bush takeaway. There's not one way of doing it.
I also do think, like, there's definitely a bit of me, like, years ago, though, that would be really nervous about, like, maybe you saying that I sent that in at like midnight the night before, and would specifically send it at 10 to 9 or whatever. And I think there's also a bit of me now that's like, I'm I'm okay with that going in when it's going in. Like unless you were to say to me, actually, it's really problematic, don't do that. Then I think there's something that's partly for me because I'm a bit more of a night owl than I am a morning worker. So for me, quite often, I really find my flow at night, and especially like I think with something like I'll always do like a couple of final proofreads before sending something in, and I will always do that the night before. And and in my head, I'm like, okay, so that'll go in at I'm aiming to send that in, 7, 8 p.m. It's just sometimes that final read through, I am so pernickety that I can really kind of get into a line or something, and but definitely. I kind of like writing evenings as well. I wish I was a sunrise, right with the sun, but it's not
Everyone's
happening.
different. Everyone's brain's different as well. I've got a couple more questions. I know we're approaching an hour just before we started wrapping things up, but one question I want to ask you as well, especially as a script editor, it's really useful for me to ask writers this, but how do you like to collaborate with people? Because obviously both in playwriting and in screenwriting, you have to get notes, you have to work with other people. It's not a individual game, we have to work as a team and stuff, but how do you like to get notes, and how do you like to collaborate with people? What would for you be a good collaboration?
I mean, I think again, I'm really fortunate because I work across theatre and screen as well, that I get to collaborate in lots of different ways. And what I really like about River City Notes is that they come via email, and then I can ask questions about it. I really like written notes. It's that thing for me. It's if you and I met face to face to talk about my notes without me having read them first, I don't think I would necessarily take everything in. And it works so much better for me to be able to see something in front of me. These are what the notes are. Have a think about them. Open the script, have a look. And that notes coming first in written form is something that I request more and more now in theatre. Before meeting someone to talk through things. And I think for me, there's a, maybe again, this is about my anxiety as well, that actually it's some kind of anchor for me. I mean, I'm kind of guessing around this, but maybe so I don't sit there going, oh my goodness, do they hate it? Do they hate it? Do they hate it? Is it awful? Am I terrible? Right. That actually, if I can see something in front of me before going, I can think about it a bit more in order to go into that conversation and know, I guess even like if someone makes a point about something, that I've been able to look it up beforehand to kind of explore it a bit. Notes. I think some people struggle with notes. I personally love notes. I also love the notes that some people might call them bad notes. And I'm hesitant to say that because I always like to, I guess, I think whatever note somebody gives you, like, it's worth looking at. Always worth looking at. And again, I'm talking in the way that it's so different when the notes you get from River City to theatre to other screen projects. Like, the notes you get are going to be completely different. I think it's always worth, even if you don't agree with the note, instinctively, like, give it the time and really kind of try to figure out behind the note. But it is part, like, I mean, you summed it up with the word collaboration. Like, a script, it's kind of the joy of what we do. A script is kind of words on a page until you bring in the other people, and I said this earlier with theatre, it's those layers and layers, and the director, the designer, the lighting designer, the actors, the audience. There you have the play, and on screen, all those elements. Like, I love what I do, and it's partly because of that collaboration, and it's not always easy. There are some people there are some people that I have worked with who feel like absolute like creative souls in every way, and you have these joyous times working together, and you're all just on the same page, and it's gorgeous and it's lovely, and you're like, this is why I do what I do. And then you have the projects that you're not on the same page, and actually, your personalities are maybe a little bit different, and there's miscommunications, and there, it's that kind of collaboration is really, I guess, in some ways, it's a fancy way of saying, like, like, can your personalities match up to make this thing often? And something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And, I think about like one of the great joys for me as a screenwriter so far was being in has been like being in writers' rooms and actually getting to collaborate with other writers, because that's not something that we really do in theatre. Like theatre, you're very much
the playwright, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean you have co-writes, sometimes, but most of the time you are the sole author of this work. I mean, my first writer's room, I was like, this is amazing. I can't solve that plot point, but they just did. And it was kind of like the spanning back and forth of ideas, and I was amazed. I absolutely kind of, I was like, I wish we did do this in theatre, could have these kind of, these groups who solve what something's going to be. I mean, I would love another writer to say, just do this, it will fix it, Yeah, like I think there's collaboration in so many different ways. Like I feel like, you and I, when we've worked on episodes of River City, that's collaborating, and you and I are communicating, and then you're working with the next person, and in some ways being a writer is a kind of you're and I don't mean to kind of play this down, but you're a small part of that big process,
Yeah, but that's when it becomes, though, like my job to make sure that you know what's going on and the reasons for it, because things change day to day on the show, like River City, where like because it's so high pressure, because it's so quick, like we might have to totally cut one of your scenes and do it without you even being like we did that. It did happen on the Christmas special together, not to give it too much away, but I had to like in like an afternoon, I had to cut one of your scenes, and ideally you would have done that because you're the writer, but I don't like doing that. I don't like being in someone else's final draft. Like, it feels like I'm tampering with their work or something. Do you know what I mean? But it is a collaboration. But again, I just called you and explained it, or emailed you and explained it, and it was totally fine because you had the reason, and you know what I mean? It wasn't like a big drama. Whereas like if I'd just done that and then you'd found out, because you'd been like, oh, what do you mean? It would maybe feel different. But that's the point in a good collaboration. It's all about communication and making sure that for me anyway, I need to, my job is to keep the writers included in the process, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and again, like it's so kind of it's communication. I think is always going to be at the heart of this, and in theatre, I guess having conversations before a rehearsal period to go, how are we going to talk about cuts? And again, it's slightly different because I guess in more that author voice way in theatre, you're signing off on every cut, like, or if we want a line change, it's coming to you. Like that's kind of that's contracted. That's it's that kind of level of detail, but that takes communication, like a lot of communication, to be able to say concisely, because everyone's short of time, everyone's short of money, to be able to say, can we change this line to this because and that's something for you then to be able to think about it, and ideally to then go, I see why that is, how about this, and offer a solution. And that's going to go back and forth and back and forth. I mean, and that could be as simple as like a line that just doesn't quite fit in an actor's mouth, like it just doesn't quite work, and it might just need a bit of a rhythm change or a smooth, or it could be something much bigger, like we don't need half of that scene, you know. And a lot that you discover in the room as well.
Completely. And it was really, really useful, I think, for people to get a bit of an overview of how to collaborate as a writer in the modern times. Another quick question for you. I'm just got two more. But what's the biggest lesson that you've learned in your career so far?
I think I am.
Are you taking your pause like we talked about earlier?
I am taking my pause. I think I am always learning, which is one of those things that's like, which bit? Back in the beginning, when I spoke about the tutor at drama school who said, trust your voice, that's the thing that will make you a writer. I think that has stood the test of time, and it's something that I say a version of to any emerging writer that I work with. Like, don't try to be that writer. Don't try to mimic them. Don't try to. You can love their voice, but I think over and over again we see that things like technique can be learned. You know, you can develop your craft. The thing that's always going to be unique to you is going to be your voice, and something can be technically brilliant, but you can see a voice in a script. You can. I think it's a thing that shines the most, even if someone.
Yeah, completely. That's what I look for whenever I read a script, and it's hard to explain that like to people because go, well, what is a voice? I can't explain what it is, but I look for it. It's really. I know that sounds really problematic to say, but you know that's what makes a good script stand out from a bad script or an ordinary script.
And I think that's like, there's so many things that I could say. You know, you're like, show up on time, be nice, like just like, I think that one about trust your voice is the one that I think has probably come back time and time again for me. And at the end of the day, no matter how nervous I get about doing something, it's always just like, go back to my voice, go back to the stories that are within me, go back to like trusting myself, and then I'll be able to do it. I was about to say.
Yeah, no, it's really, really useful lessons. I appreciate you sharing that. And just to close off, what's the sort of thing that surprised you most in your career so far?
Honestly, I think the fact that I have a career. Getting the dog.
Perfectly timed from the dog there.
Come here, meet too. And you can be cute.
There you go. You can be on YouTube. You can be on YouTube now with the dog's name.
There we go. This is Rowan.
Rowan's now being a guest on the show. He's going to be on YouTube. There you go.
There we go. Could you ask me that question again?
Yeah. What's been the biggest surprise in your career so far? Just to close off.
So genuinely, I think that I have made this a career, and I don't think I quite understood that as I was going along, because I am like, I've always been a grafter. Like I was putting in the hours. I was when the pandemic hit, I went and did a master's. You know, like I've always kind of kept my head down and done the work and kept going. And then there's kind of a moment that you go, oh, I am doing the thing that I dreamed of. And it's quite hard sometimes to kind of take a wee pause to go, oh, actually, having a play at the Lyceum, I dreamed about that. Working for River City, I dreamed about that. And I'm a full-time writer. I dreamed about that. And that for me has, I think, still surprises me. And I don't want to sound kind of, daft about this, but like, it's what we spoke about earlier. Like it was a dream when I was a kid. People that I knew didn't get to be writers. And here I am getting to be a writer, or being a writer, not getting to be, being a writer.
And deserving to be a writer as well, not just getting to be one for the sake of it, like deserving to be a writer.
And it makes you go, okay, so I think a lot about keeping the ladder, like putting the ladder back down. Like I think a lot about how do I work with emerging playwrights and writers, and I mentor, and I think it's exactly what we were talking about earlier about the working class voices coming through the industry, and those are the voices that I want to mentor and to work with. And there's a bit of me that goes, you know, I had 3 main stage plays on as a working class woman back to back. I had the Stamping Ground Run Rig musical, I did the Snow Queen at Lyceum, and then we had Sunset Song last year. And that's like, it's taken me a long time to pause and to think about that. But I think I'm a woman and I'm a working class writer, and it's kind of unbelievable. But it also makes me go, okay, so who's the next working class female writer that's going to get to do that? Because we don't have enough female voices writing for main stages. We don't have enough working class voices on those stages. And same in screen, you know, again, statistics over and over and over tell us. And diversity, inclusion, like we have to keep working our way and pushing. Sorry, that was a long answer for
no,
you.
It's not, honestly, very nice. A very nice way to close things off. Just before I let you go, Morna, do you have anything on that you want to plug? What are you working on at the moment? What's coming up, and where can people find you?
What am I working on at the moment? See, I repeated your question. I'm working on River City at the moment, and I head out to New York next week, which is quite exciting. I'm working on a new musical. And actually this week I'm working on a children's show. I don't think I can actually talk about any of them particularly.
No, it's all right. There's a little teaser. You're working on many things. You're a very busy woman. There you go.
It's always that kind of moment that, you know, I'm never quite sure what I can say about anything. And it's almost like it's not until something's announced that I kind of breathe enough to go, I can talk about this now, right? Can I talk about this? Can we talk about this? But no River City spoilers.
No, of course not. Of course not. Yeah. No, Morna, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work, and having worked with you before, I'm really chuffed with the Christmas special we got to do together for River City last year. Nearly said this year, but last year. But no, it's a pleasure for you coming on the show, and I really appreciate you being so honest and open with us about your experiences and anxieties and time in this industry. I think it's going to be a really useful episode for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.